we're got about 15 who have joined. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jack Glassman. I'm chair of the Historic Resources Committee. I'm also a historical architect and project manager for the National Park Service, our Interior Region 1 regional office. And welcome on, thank you for joining us on this Veterans Day. I'd like to, I think, maybe speak for all of us here just to acknowledge, remember the service of all veterans, their service to the country, past and present, especially pay tribute to those who are living veterans, those who are still here with us, to thank them, and also their families for all of their contributions and sacrifices, which are huge in many cases. So just a few sort of current events, things that are of interest. I gather my papers here that I thought I would hopefully be interested in sharing. Item one is the Parker House Hotel, now known as the Omni, or known for many years as Omni Boston Parker House. It is slated, or it may gain Boston landmark status. The hotel, it's been, as a number of papers reported, it's been a Boston icon since it opened in 1855, and it was considered the longest continuously operating hotel in the country until the onset of COVID-19, when it shut down. And I think it was really the oldest, due to some interesting technicalities where the building, and then there was an addition that was preserved, and the rest of it was, but it did, so the building, as you can see in the photos, has, changed and grown and been rebuilt, but it wasn't continuous operation until that point. And it's also iconic for its culinary, the famous Parker House rolls and the Boston cream pie, not to mention all of the connections with famous personalities and politicians, and the political contribution. As I suppose it has that strategic location, really, sort of between Boston City Hall and the Massachusetts State House. So the study report is available at the Landmarks Commission. I just took a quick glance at it if anyone's interested in, and then there's a public hearing for the proposal on November 23rd. Melville Avenue, Dorchester. This another property that may become a city landmark. It's been proposed. This house was designed by Arthur Meacham, who is the architect of the who designed, I should say, the Boston Public Garden, a number of other structures around the city, and it became famous for the boy band, New Kids on the Block, as the home of Jonathan and Jordan Knight, who are pictured there. So through all these different contexts, it also happens to be for sale. It was sold by the family many years ago to the Salvation Army, and now it's on the market again. So check the listing if you're interested, but obviously it has some significance for its architectural significance as well, for its stick style, Queen Anne style. You can see on the right, the carriage house on the back, though, is, as the listing says, I guess, it's in bad major need of repair. So the hotel Buckminster Hotel was also that's changed hands, sold to a life science developer, IQHQ. They closed a deal recently to buy the hotel, which had been shuttered since, I guess, March of 2020. So it's, move my nuts out of the way. I found a few old photos. It is notorious and famous as the place where ostensibly the 1919 the World Series, the Chicago White Sox, where they so-called through the World Series. That was against the Cincinnati Reds, but it was in Boston. And then this is where supposedly the plan was hatched in one of the rooms. What I'm curious about is, it certainly makes sense in the location with Longwood Medical nearby and Kenmore Square and so on for life science for a lab. I'm just curious how a footprint or, sort of how a hotel converts to lab space because of the small room, all the partitions in the room. So that will be interesting to see, as well as what some of them not talked about is whether they'll, what they want to do to the building or in terms of adding additions, because there are some 200 and 300 foot structures that are in design development, really across the street in different directions, a lot of height. So we'll see what pressure is on there. And if anyone knows any more about that or wants to weigh in, then feel free to interrupt me. I was nervous about how to describe this next item, just because the article by Joan Wickersham was so eloquently written, but I just wanted to share a recent article in the Globe entitled "Time in the Museum." Joan Wickersham is she's an author. She has a column that appears regularly in the Globe, and it just so happens her husband Jay is past president of the BSA. He's an attorney with architectural training, an architectural historian, specialist in Bullfinch. But Joan was writing about how she returned to the Museum of Fine Arts, the MFA, recently, and of course, it had been closed for a long time, and how just going through, she was writing about going through the European galleries, and looking at these Dutch 17th century still life paintings, and she featured, I'm pretty sure is this one, the painting by this Dutch artist, apologies for pronunciation, but Jan Davids de Heem, painted in 1653, this still life, and sort of acknowledged for its virtuosity and the way he treated just the glowing fruit and the reflections and the goblet that seems almost transparent, and the reflections in the silver and everything, the amount of detail. But she goes on to sort of reflect beyond that. And I'll read the one paragraph. One of the miraculous things about Dutch 17th century still life paintings is the paradoxical way that they make time stand still, while at the same time reminding you that time is always moving. Here is the eternal moment, but there is no eternal moment, because look, the pie is already shattered and ruined. The grapes are crawling with ants. The cup is tipped over. The leaves are starting to wither and brown. Time is passing. The scene is already beginning to decay, even as it is being painted. So I don't know, to me, it was just a wonderful, the metaphor. And then she goes on to just sort of talk about the museum itself and the sort of the still life, how it's there, the larger context, even the Dutch paintings represent how, what financed these was well, there was a plague, also that from early European history, but then just the colonialism and slavery, all the things that are sort of built into that. What struck me about the time, about standing still but still moving, was how we, in our fields, the way we are all connected to historic resources is the same sort of thing. I mean, collectively, between all our different fields and professions, we're observing, and we're interpreting, and we're interceding, and we're conserving, and we're adapting and converting and reusing. So we're, in the sense of, well, there's this artificial construct called the period of significance, but what we're really doing, of course, is managing change. Change is happening even as we sort of focus on a certain point. So I don't know, to me, it was just interesting, the metaphors that I see, or at least I imagine seeing, but I do recommend checking out Joan Wickersham's short piece called Time in the Museum. Moving on to somehow something lighter and darker at the same time. There's a sort of summary in the Globe about video games, about about 8 or 9, I guess, video games that all somehow include Boston themes, a sort of virtual tour of Boston past or future, some of which will bring you back to American Revolutionary times, and others that are going forward to sort of post-apocalyptic times. So like this view here of the from the Fallout 4, the view of the Paul Revere statue and the North Church behind it, and then Bunker Hill Monument. And then during the other sort of right way to pass the time for MIT students during the pandemic was that they modeled for Minecraft, they modeled the MIT campus, I guess, in detail, and that's something one can do. I couldn't help though to look at some of these images though and sort of compare it to some of the mock-ups that we've seen for sea level rise, and where you say this is what will happen at 1.5 degrees, or this is what will happen at 2 degrees, and it's sort of couldn't get that out of my head. Anyway, virtual sort of video games is not my thing, but if it is for any of you guys out there who would think it might be an interesting thing to drill into and actually do a presentation just for the rest of us about the Boston connections, I think that would be really fun. So that's an invitation to you to do that. As Susan Bronner just also mentioned, so a late addition to our of note was the New York Times runs an occasional column that they call Overlooked, where they it's a series of obituaries about remarkable people whose deaths beginning in 1851 were not reported in the Times. So it's like they're sort of playing catch up. And so this one piece was about Louise Blanchard Bethune, who, as it said, she was not only changed the face of Buffalo, all the different building types. She was particularly interested in educational institutions, but she designed a women's prison, factories, this Lafayette Hotel, which has recently had some more work, actually, rehab work, and considered to have been the first American woman to become a sort of certified, as it said, registered architect. So anyway, nice story if you're interested. She was going to attend a Cornell program, it's one of the oldest, but instead decided to apprentice in the sort of traditional fashion. The most momentous, I guess, one of the decisions that she made was she was invited to contribute to design a building for the Columbian Exposition, but she turned it down. As it said, one of the most decisive moments. She was asked to enter a design competition for the women's building, but she refused to enter, citing her disgust with the paltry winner's prize for women of $1,000, which was compared to the men's prize of $10,000. And women were competing to design only one building, while 13 buildings were reserved for men. So I don't know, sort of echoes to me things we've been saying in like the soccer league and so on. So small steps forward. So with that, I'm happy to I'd like to turn it over to our featured guest speaker, Matt Duggan, who's with the architectural team. I've sort of been familiar with and known about the architectural team since the beginning of my career, actually, from when I was in and just after school working at Stephan and Bradley, and the architectural team was certainly a noble adversary for at that time. We're a multi-housing project, including a lot that were rehabs of mills and schools and so on. Sadly, the Stephan Bradley closed up shop a number of years ago, but glad to see that the architectural team has grown and prospered and diversified, and now doing major, major projects, including high rises. And so wonderful to have Matt Duggan, who is a project manager at TAT, who specializes in adaptive use. I'll let you take it away. Thank you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Jack. Is everyone able to hear me fine and see the image on the screen?
I can, yeah.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about the Archer Building in Beacon Hill. It was the first building built for Suffolk University, and it is just over 100 years old. It's 101 years old now. We did a project that just completed in 2020, which was the adaptive reuse and addition and partial facade replacement for the building. And it was converted from a variety of uses, which we'll talk about in this talk, for Suffolk University into a residential use today. And then I'll also touch on the history of the public realm around the site, specifically Temple Street, which actually has a pretty interesting history. So here is the cornerstone for the Archer Building being laid in 1920. And the Archer Building was named after the founder of Suffolk University, which is Gleason Archer. And in this image is actually then Governor Calvin Coolidge at the groundbreaking and the cornerstone laying for the building. So the building has gone through 4 expansions, 5 kind of major building projects through its history. So the first building was a 4-story building that was facing Dern Street. And as the building expanded, its front door really shifted to Temple Street, which we'll talk about more as we go through. So here you can see the highlighted original portion of the building. And then so that was in 1920. In the early 30s, they built an expansion to the north, further down Temple Street, which you can see highlighted here. And then in the late 30s, they built an expansion vertically. So they essentially built a 5th and 6th floor on top of the building. Then in the mid 60s, they doubled the size of the building with a mid-century modern addition, which was known as the Donahue building. And then in 2020, there was an addition done on the roof, which is part of our project. And then here is an image kind of showing where the building is today at 100 years. So one of the things that I always find interesting is we often, when we're doing adaptive reuse of a project, we really focus in on the history of that building. But especially in sites like Beacon Hill, the building that we're doing the adaptive reuse intervention to is often just one part of the history of the site. So this part of Boston, is one of the original portions of Boston. The site is actually directly behind the State House on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And you can see here that there were a series of mixed-use buildings that were located on the site of the Archer Building before it was built in 1920. And it's always an interesting thing talking about that moment in time and that still life, right? That's always changing. You can see that there was some history that was lost when these buildings were taken out. So you can see the image of the demolition for the Archer Building. So here is an image of the original building. One thing that we'll talk about a little bit later, but I'll point out here because it's a bigger image. On the right side of the building, you'll see that there is a marquee. It's a little hard to read, but it says Suffolk Photo Play Theater. So one of the things that was done to help finance Suffolk University is that they incorporated a novel new entertainment venue which was the movie theater. So they had a movie theater on Temple Street that ran, I think, until the 30s. I'm not entirely sure on the date of it, but it was also used as a lecture hall for the law school. So then here you can see that in the late 30s, this is an image from, and you can see the addition that I was talking about to the north has been built. And also they have added a big lit up sign on the roof of the building that says Suffolk Law School. And then here is the second edition. This is the vertical edition. One thing that was interesting as we were doing the rehab to the Archer building is that across these three editions, there were three styles of windows. Another thing that was kind of interesting about this is that the windows were actually steel, even in 1920. But the windows in the 1920s portion really mimic the profiles of a wood window. And then as you get into the late 1930s portion, they were no longer trying to mimic a wood window profile. It really was starting to embrace the material. And so this was much thinner mullions, still had a divided light pattern, but it was a much thinner mullion, really kind of embracing the material. So as we go further to the north on Temple Street, this is now an image of the buildings that were on the site prior to the Donahue extension that was built in the mid-1960s. So you can see there's a church here, which is actually opposite what is now the Temple Street Park. At the time, there was not a park there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through, but you can see there was a series of row homes and also some taller rooming homes as well. So here's an image of the Donahue building. You can see that it is using a reinforced concrete technique, which ironically is the same building technique, with its variations for all phases of this building. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further into the presentation. But it is interesting that despite the fact that the exterior styles of the building are quite different, the construction techniques are all variations of the same technique. So shortly after the Donahue building was built, all of the steel windows in the Archer building were replaced with aluminum windows of essentially the same style as the Donahue building. And ironically, they were not double pane glass. So we do not know the exact rationale for why they did that. It does not appear like it was for energy conservation reasons. But all the windows were replaced in the mid-60s. So now I'll talk a little bit about the public realm that has evolved over the 100 years of the life of the Archer building. So here's an image of Temple Street. In the distance, you can see that there's a set of stairs that lead up to the State House Park. So if you're familiar with this kind of tucked away corner on the side of the State House, there is a park over what is now a parking garage that has the firefighters memorial, and it also has one of the major entrances to the State House, on the day-to-day entrances. At one point, that park actually was a reservoir, a covered reservoir for the city, and then it was also used as a parking lot. And so kind of in that theme of parking becoming king, you can see that in this image here, Temple Street really was kind of, unfortunately, your typical Boston street where you've got a narrow sidewalk, or I should say typical Beacon Hill Boston Street. You have a narrow sidewalk and on-street parking. And so certainly you do see a pedestrian in this image, but you see a lot more cars than you do people. And this street was one of the first streets in the city to really get not quite universal design, but a kind of predecessor of universal design, where the pedestrian was made to be more prominent, or at least equally prominent with the vehicle. So you can see here, there's an image on the left, says "Coming soon to Pedestrian Street." This is from 1970. And what was done here was essentially the parking lane was removed, the sidewalks were expanded, and in fact, on the wider portion of the sidewalk, it actually has a flush curb condition, and it has a series of granite benches and street trees, as well as 1970s historic gas lights. It's one of the things that is interesting about Beacon Hill is that the gas lights are all from the 20th century. But you can see that the transformation and bringing the pedestrian to the forefront was something that this street really pioneered. So you can see an image on the right. I'm sure it was taken where the photographer intentionally made sure there were no vehicles in the image. But you can now see that pedestrians are able to walk right down the center of the street. That is the case today. I think getting rid of the curb cut on the one side really does make vehicles go a lot slower, and it does encourage pedestrians to, when it's safe, to go in, go into the area where vehicles sometimes go, or often do go. And another thing to note here, one of the reasons why this street did have this project done is it is one of the least steep passages up from Cambridge Street to the top of Beacon Hill. So here's a site plan of half of Temple Street. It's centered around the Archer building, but another piece of the public realm that evolved over the 100 years of the Archers' life so far was the creation of Temple Street Park. And again, it talks a little bit about how we have treated our built history and how that's evolved over the past 100 years quite a bit. So the site of the Temple Street Park, before it was Temple Street Park, was a parking lot. So in 2002, the city of Boston, with great help from the Beacon Hill Association, neighborhood association, purchased this parking lot and converted it into a pocket park. Prior to it being a parking lot, it was actually two wood frame buildings dating back from 1787. So they were torn down in the 50s, again, with the car becoming king. And it's not very big, so it didn't house very many cars, but the idea of having two buildings from 1787 versus a parking lot for a handful of cars at the time, the general consensus was, at least the powers to be, was that the parking lot was a more important resource. And it also talks a little bit about what buildings were considered important. I think perhaps at this point, an old wood frame building was considered something that really wasn't what was all about in Beacon Hill. One other thing I do want to point out at this point is, while that is what was happening, that's not what everyone, as you know's opinions was. So the Beacon Hill Historic District was established 3 years later in 1955. It wasn't extended to this part of Beacon Hill until 1963, however. So here's an image from this year, earlier this year, of the Temple Street Park. And you can see also the project that I was involved in, that TAT was involved in the foreground here, which is facing Temple Street Park. So keep in mind, when the Donahue building, which is what we are looking at here, was originally built, this park did not exist. This was a newly constructed parking lot at the time. So the building has housed many uses It was the original law school for Suffolk University at the time. It was the Suffolk Law School. And the vertical addition that was built in the late 1930s created a double height with mezzanine law library. So that was one of the uses that was part of the project or part of the building. Also, as I touched on earlier, there was the Suffolk Photoplays movie theater, which was later converted into lecture space and performing arts space. And the law library itself was converted later on in the building's history. The law library had a bunch of regularly spaced large windows, and that worked out well to be a space for the performing arts. So while this was originally built as the law school, it was later used as a performing arts building for Suffolk University, and it also had science laboratory space as well. So the classrooms were converted from law classrooms to science labs, and then eventually into residential homes. In the Donahue building, there was actually a subterranean dining hall, and in the latest adaptive reuse of the project, that subterranean level was actually converted into a small parking garage. So one of the common criticisms of modernist architecture is that oftentimes the idea of having the program on the inside of the building or the circulation on the inside of the building being expressed on the exterior of the building is a characteristic that is employed. And that is something that did happen in the Donahue building that made its ability and nimbleness to adjust to different uses a little bit more difficult than in the Archer building. So in the Archer building, you can see on the 4th floor that large set of windows. You can see those 4 large windows right in the middle of the building. That was the law library. And so as that was converted into different uses, it still was able to get the natural light that those windows afforded, and therefore was able to become other things such as performing arts space. The Donahue building, it also housed a law library. So essentially the law library was expanded into the Donahue building as that addition was built. And it was located, as you might be able to guess by how I've been describing this building, in the center 2 floors. So there's a series of irregular windows there, different than the ribbon windows that are on the other 4 floors of the building. And the large blank wall that housed restrooms. There was a stair that connected the 2 levels of the law library and other spaces that at initial use did not want to have windows, but did make it challenging for the university and then later for our project to be able to utilize these floors for anything other than something that you really didn't want to have too much natural light or ventilation. So here is an image of the Archer building. You can see those large windows I was talking about. The project did involve creating new windows to match the historic profiles of the existing windows. So we've had Suffolk University has a great archive of images, which I was able to utilize for this presentation, but it also helped us understand what the original fenestration pattern were for the windows. So we were able to do a pretty accurate reproduction of those windows. I said that all of the windows were replaced in the mid 60s, and that was not completely accurate. There were a handful of surviving windows on the Ridgeway Lane side of the building. So Ridgeway Lane runs parallel to this image here. So there's a few surviving windows there. So we were able to get a little bit more information on what those profiles were as well. So you can see that the new windows installed in the Archer building here. You can also see 2 doors into what was formerly the movie theater. The marquee had long since been taken down when we began the project, but those doors were able to be utilized as direct entries into a residential home. Another thing of note about the style of architecture of the Donahue building is that even when programmatically windows were not desired, such as in the projector room for the theater, they had created brick detailing to mimic and evoke windows. And so we were able to utilize those openings, or those faux openings, to create new windows to work well with the new residential use that is behind those windows. So you can see here on the second and first floor of the building was more horizontally oriented windows. Those are the new insertions. And going with the National Park Service still briefs, we did go in with a different style of window intentionally for those openings to help tell the story that these were new insertions to the project as opposed to original 1920s design. So when it comes to the mid 1960s modernist edition, we kind of come in with the preconceived notion that the facade needed to be removed. For better or worse, that was the preconceived notion. And as the process went through, we started to question that, and that was directly kind of influenced by Docomomo, which I believe some of you may be very familiar with, and if you're not familiar with it, it stands for the Documentation and Conservation of the Modernist Movement. So the New England chapter had reached out to us as we were going through the Beacon Hill historic, the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission process. And they were concerned that if the history of the mid-century modern building was erased, that we would be doing the same issues that had happened in the past. And that while mid-century modern buildings aren't really in the period of influence of Beacon Hill, they're certainly a part of our built history and something that we should preserve, at least its spirit and memory. So for a variety of reasons, probably most importantly, not the programmatic reasons with the facade that was the challenge. It was more importantly the technical issues with the facade. We did replace the facade. However, we tried to take the partie of that facade and use it for the new design. So some of the issues that we had with this facade is, as I was saying, the design of the construction technique was evolving across all of the additions, and they hadn't quite mastered the idea of a non-mass wall when this building was built. So this was essentially a non-mass wall. So it was non-bearing. However, it was not a cavity wall. So there were issues where moisture mitigation, something the wall was not built to survive, unfortunately. And then on top of that, there were hazardous materials used in all of the window caulking. So essentially all of the brick around the windows would have to be removed in order to replace any of the windows. So there's several issues that kind of pushed us to replacing the facade. So what we did in order to try to keep the memory and the spirit of this mid-century building surviving into this next phase was to try to analyze its partie. So we took a look at Le Corbusier's 5 points towards a new architecture, which are pilotis, or expressing the supports, the columns, which you can see in this image the Donahue building did do at its entrance. The use of a flat roof surface for a roof garden was one of the 5 points, and that was something that we really embraced in the new design and was partially embraced in the original. There actually was a pavilion on the roof of the Donahue building in the initial construction. It was more utilitarian than roof garden, but the idea of having a kind of pavilion and occupiable roof was present in the initial design. Horizontal windows was something that was expressed in the Donahue building. And the design of a free facade, in it being a non-bearing facade, was something that was utilized. They had really pushed the idea of using that to express the circulation and the program on the inside of the building. But that is something that we tried to take in the new design. And then the free design of the ground plane, typically, I mean, this can be looked at in a lot of ways. I think the most direct way when it was originally written was essentially you don't have bearing walls, so you don't have to be restrictive to what's happening above, below. So programmatically, that was utilized here, where there's a lobby on the ground floor, and then also by expressing those supports, it's somewhat utilized here by having the building have that large overhang at the entrance. So beyond those 5 points, this building had a couple other characteristic mid-century modern features. One, it had a very planar, tight skin, and in its own way, it was quite contextual. It used 2 characteristic Beacon Hill materials, being brick, red brick, and granite. And then, as I already pointed out, it did have a base that was expressed with supports. It also had used ribbon windows to express the base, so it ended up having a kind of traditional layout of a base, middle, and top. So here's an image of the Archer and Donahue buildings from before our intervention. You can see the north facade, which is the one facing us, had very little windows. And then the facade on the left side of the image is what's facing Temple Street. So you can see the base, middle, and top with the ribbon windows, punch windows in the center where the library originally was, and then the punch window or the ribbon windows on the top. So here's an image of a rendering we had put together through the design process, where we started to try to take that partie and then expand upon it with some of our kind of urbanist ideals that we were trying to bring to the building. And namely, those 2 ones that we really tried to push here was activating the ground plane, activating the sidewalk, which is something that the original building did not do that successfully. And then also trying to continue what they had done fairly successfully, but we tried to push it a little bit further, which was having a modernist language, but being contextual to the neighborhood. So you can see here, the image on the top was the building before our intervention. The image on the bottom is our intervention. And you can see that the majority of the buildings further down the hill are 4- and 5-story buildings. And from the beginning, the Donahue building did acknowledge that, in the sense that the top 2 floors created a bit of a cornice line if you kind of squint your eyes with those ribbon windows that line up approximately with the cornice line of the majority of the street. And we tried to push that a little bit further, which we'll get into in some of the next images. At the ground level, though, it did not embrace the sidewalk in a very successful manner. Essentially, it did have the express supports that created a modern portico. However, other than that, it essentially had one level that matched up with where the front entrance was, and did not have any additional openings or any other articulation. So essentially, as you walk down the hill, you had a blank wall that grew taller and taller as you walked your way down the hill. So one of the things we tried to address was the fact that there now is the Temple Street Park across from this. So we expanded the material differentiation at the entrance to kind of center itself on the park, which ironically actually created more of an asymmetric design for the building overall. It's essentially the opposite relationship of kind of brick to granite at the base that was in the original building, but we've essentially kind of slid that granite piece to be centered on the park, which the opposite side of the park is actually a rough granite, the rough granite apse of a church on Bowden Street. So there's a nice material connection there. And it's also the location of the church that was demolished, which was a granite church, in order to build the Donahue building. So it also kind of echoes that history as well. And then as a result, we've now created a narrower portion of brick that meets the ground. And in that area, we introduced 2 direct entry units to the building. So we're trying to have more variety at the base of the building, but also to have the active use of having direct entries into homes, which is essentially what the rest of the street is. We continued the party of having ribbon windows at the base and at the top of the building. And at the base, those ribbon windows actually line up with a 2-story unit. So that direct entry door that you see there actually is 2 levels, and it enjoys those horizontal windows that turn the corner. So again, it is reflective of the program on the inside, as is a characteristic of modernist buildings, but we tried to make the building have more regular window patterns so that in its next life, if there is a conversion, there is that regular light and air ability to get into the building and not be so specific to the initial use. And then as you go to the next image, you'll see how we took that 5th and 6th level cornice line idea and pushed it a little further. So I'll quickly go through the 5 points. You can see here at the entrance, Temple Street Park is to the left. This is the main entrance into the new Archer residences. And you can see the supports are expressed, much like they were in the Donahue building, but you can see we've extended it 2 structural bays to the north to really line it up with the park. The roof garden, that was popular in the 20s as an idea with the modernists, and it's really become a popular idea for residential and even office architecture today. So here's an image of the roof garden on the Archer building. Here is an image of the first floor of the building, and you can see by not having the exterior or the interior bearing walls be present, and having it be a pointed slab system, as was really advocated by the modernists, you're able to get that inside out connection. So you can see here in this space, you've just got wall to wall glass. So you really feel that you are connected with the outdoors. And here we actually have an indoor outdoor planter. So there's a planter on the exterior side of that glazing, and there's also a planter on the interior side of that glazing. Another thing that is kind of interesting about this project as a whole is that as Korb was writing his 5 points towards a new architecture, he was responding to buildings such as the Archer, which were buildings using modern technology, but not fully, in his opinion, utilizing its advantage. So as I was noting earlier, the Archer building is reinforced concrete. It does not have bearing walls on the interior. It does have bearing walls on the exterior, which is one of the things that that Korb and the other modernists are really advocating to not do, is to have that free facade. But it is interesting that this project really sees that evolution of the construction technique and the aesthetic techniques, from one room to the next. So here we are looking at point number 4, the ribbon windows or the horizontal windows. So not only do they create that horizon line, kind of unobstructed view inside the building, but they also can be utilized, especially here where we've turned the corner, to be a cornice line, if you will, in a much stronger way than when it was just on the Temple Street facade. So you can see here, there really is that strong line at the 4th floor that, while not exactly lined up with the cornice line of the 4-story building on the right of the image, it really does, as you're walking on the street, especially with the sky kind of reflecting on the glass, give you that sense that there is a datum line that continues down the street. And this image also is a good one to talk about the fifth point of the free facade. Here, by eroding the corners, not only are we able to create that kind of contextual nod and have that spectacular view from within the units, but we are also able to really express the fact that the facade is non-bearing and that it is a series of columns that is supporting the building. And so you do have that freedom without having the exterior bearing wall to erode the corner and have it be glass as shown here. So here again is the image of the project taken from a drone earlier this year. So you can see the pavilion like structures on the roof with the roof gardens. You can see those ribbon windows and get a sense for how it all fits together into the neighborhood and also into the earlier portions of the Archer building. So that concludes a history of the last 100 years of the Archer building and Temple Street. So if anyone has any questions, or if there is time, Jack, for questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Matt. That was masterful. I mean, it's the building. It looks like it's successful on so many levels, and you did explain so well the approach and looking at all those different aspects and levels. So that it was just wonderful. I'll just kick off just the first question I have, just from a few slides back. The way you treated that corner, yeah. So with the eroded corner and the ribbon windows, and then I think I'm seeing some joints there. So my question is, did the existing brick, with all the different changes and the new openings punched and ribbon, and was that all actually new? And if so, were those like prefabricated brick panels, or did you keep what you could and then just do traditional cutting and toothing and all that sort of thing?
So we did take down the brick on the Donahue building, and we went back with a brick that was a similar brick to the original, but that it's now a cavity wall system where previously it wasn't. So it is all new brick and new steel lintels to help support all of that brick.
Yeah, it looks like water struck. Great. Any other questions? Let's see. Feel free to unmute and ask away.
I've got an easy question. And by the way, I thought that, or I think that renovation is amazing. I mean, it blends in to the neighborhood far more now than it did as it existed prior to the renovation. But how many years did it take to work on this? And I apologize if I missed that point.
So the job number for the project is 2014. I think we really got seriously working on it in 2015, and then construction was about 2 years. So it was basically 5 years from really starting design to building being occupied.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely wasn't expecting to hear the term Le Corbusier and Beacon Hill together.
Yeah, it might have been the first time it was ever discussed at a Beacon Hill Architectural Commission meeting.
Yeah, but that was also fascinating about the reinforced concrete and all the different times in modern history, and this site, the way that was the basis.
Each phase was slightly different. They used terracotta for the formwork. It has the flutes essentially in the first phase. Then they went to, a kind of proto composite deck in the 30s, and then they went to a flat slab construction in the 60s. It was constantly evolving. It was actually kind of quite interesting to see from a building technique standpoint, not fascinating from a technical aspect of every time we had to do a penetration through a slab, we had to have a different detail,
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the process in Beacon Hill? Like, there's a historic commission. Is there like a design review board? I mean, what are all the people who are looking and telling, watching over the process?
Yes, so there's the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission, which is essentially a design review board. And BCDC technically also had review of the project as well. They voted to defer to the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission. So we didn't have two review boards to go through, really just one. And so the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission, they see everything. They'll see a project where someone is repainting their front door, and then they'll see projects such as this. So when you look at their agenda, it is quite fascinating to see the variety of projects on the list.
And they've got BCDC, it's citywide, that's the Boston Civic Design Commission, which is, I guess, mostly architects volunteer on the commission.
And so essentially, in order to get a building permit, you need to get a certificate of appropriateness from the Beacon Hill Architectural Commission.
So is that a legal requirement, or, I mean, their recommendations are binding, or is it advisory?
It is binding. It actually is. The state legislature has actually created the historic district. So so it even supersedes the city's permitting process.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Could I just get clarification about the materials that you mentioned for the different sections, the oldest building, and also you mentioned that windows of the oldest building were, I think you said steel, but that they weren't there anymore. So I was wondering how you knew that, and but just could you just like simply say what the construction systems were for the different sections, and then
Sure.
about the windows? Okay.
So in the initial 1920s portion of the building, the exterior wall was a bearing wall. It was cast in place concrete with a masonry veneer, and the columns and slabs were cast in place concrete with terracotta used to lighten the load. So essentially, it's kind of lost formwork terracotta that became the flutes. And then
Wait, I'm sorry, the floors were terracotta, or?
the floors were reinforced concrete, but when the ceilings were removed, you see the terracotta that was actually used as the formwork. So they probably built up temporary shoring or temporary supports out of wood, laid a flat plank down, then they laid down spaced terracotta. They were hollow and quite thick. And then they laid the reinforcing bars in between that terracotta, and then they cast the concrete on top of that. And then after it cured, they removed the supports below. So when the ceilings were removed, you saw essentially probably 2/3 terracotta, 1/3 concrete exposed. So that was the technique that was used in the 20s. And then in the 30s, they went to just a straight reinforced concrete without that terracotta. Again, it had reinforced concrete walls with the brick veneer cast into it. And then in the late 30s vertical edition, they had started to use a composite deck. So instead of using terracotta for the fluting to make the slab lighter, they actually used a thin steel pan that the concrete was cast into. And then when we got to the 60s portion it was a flat slab, so there was no flutes, it was just a flat bottom to the concrete slabs. And there, the exterior wall was non-bearing and had a series of exterior columns that were, well, columns on the edge of the building that were interior to the building. But the actual brick on the exterior was not bearing, which is unique for this building. It was the first phase that had that characteristic. And then talking about the exteriors, all buildings had brick as the primary material, all phases. The base and the cornices of the 1920s through 30s edition were all precast concrete. And in the 1960s portion, it was granite. It was used at the base. And the windows were aluminum in the 60s portion. The replacement windows were aluminum. And I had corrected myself midway through the presentation. The vast majority of the windows were all replaced in the mid-60s. However, there were a few surviving windows on the Ridgeway Lane facade of the building, which we hadn't pictured in these slides, but it's parallel to this image here, one block over. So there were some surviving windows on that side of the building, and that's how we knew that they were steel, and we knew how there was actually 3 different profiles depending on which edition or which portion of the building you were in.
They're operable steel windows.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So the new double hungs or double hung profiles are aluminum.
The new ones are, yes. And they're actually in the Archer building. They are the true divided light aluminum. So each pane of glass is an individual pane. It's not an applied mullion.
I'm sure the commission was happy with that, or pushed for that.
Yeah, both. They were very happy, and they definitely pushed for it as well.
Can you talk about the challenges of working on such a construction site? I mean, the actual construction.
Logistics. Yeah, so there was quite a bit of challenges. The biggest one, and I think the contractor here actually did a great job with this. Maybe not perfect, but they did a good job of this. The biggest challenge is probably working in such a dense site that's a residential site. So again, not pictured here, but Ridgeway Lane is about a 15-foot wide right-of-way. So when the exterior work was done on that side of the building, they actually had to build scaffolding that was had about a 2-story clearance underneath, so vehicles could travel underneath it. And so they built scaffolding across the entire street. And so that was a challenge, logistically, but then making sure that the project was as good of a neighbor as possible to the neighborhood. It was another big challenge. So things like, how do you keep the building safe from fire prevention standpoint by having lights on, but how do you at the same time not, have this be a giant lantern? Were all things that had to kind of get worked out, and just making sure that that there was space to stage to do all this work without completely disrupting the neighborhood was a challenge. Another challenge that wasn't in that vein was some of the stormwater retention for the site. Boston does have a requirement that you don't take your stormwater, so rainwater, directly into the storm system. They want there to be some retention, or ideally some way of actually infiltrating it back into the groundwater. You can see here, there isn't really, outdoor space to do that. So that had to be accommodated underneath the building. So that was another challenge with a tight site such as this.
I've got a question. Who were the original architects of each phase of the Archer and Donahue complex?
That I'll send that information to Jack and you can distribute it. I don't have that at my fingertips.
Hello, Todd, by the way. A great question coming from someone who grew up a stone's throw away from the site.
Yeah. I lived on Joy Street.
Good to see you. Any other questions? I assume the roof deck, so are those native, like plant materials and trying to do a kind of a green roof in places that are within the
Yes, they
Urban
are.
area.
So essentially, if you can kind of really look hard, you can see that there's a green zone on the building
Oh, yeah.
closer to us in this image. That is a sedum roof, so that it does not require irrigation. It's basically a low to no maintenance plant, and that goes from roof edge back to the hard surface for that roof garden. And then the other larger roof garden has a variety of native plants in planters, including some trees, and those do have some drip irrigation.
Thank you. Well, if no other questions, then I wanted to thank you again. Just it's a treat just to learn about the project.
Thank you. It's fun. It's fun reliving the memories of the project and talking about it. It's definitely an interesting one.
Yeah. Oh, when with Abigail said the questions about the logistics, I was thinking, the first answer would be last hours of sleep, trying to figure out how to sidewalk bridges or how to deal with the neighbors. So, okay. I hope everyone got the agenda. For some reason, I'm not able to just drop the agenda into the chat. I don't know why. What's with that, but I don't know if maybe, Matt, if you stopped sharing, whether that would still work, but there are a few things going on. Why don't I try that anyway? See if I can drag it. No, it just doesn't seem to let me do that. But a number of things going on, including tomorrow, actually. Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, SGH, they've got a webinar tomorrow, Lunch and Learn, noontime, why metals break, metallurgical investigations of fracture and fatigue in building materials. So that should be an interesting technical session if it's not too late. What's not on my list, I just wanted to share the National Park Service had just sort of delayed, but they're looking for our group actually in Lowell, looking for a historical architect, GS 12 level Park Service position. That would be start out as a 13-month term, but could then convert into a longer period. So it's only through the USA Jobs that closes on November 17th. So it's sort of a short notice, but it would be a great job working on a number of projects that our group was working on, including out at Minuteman National Historical Park, some projects leading up to the 2025 anniversary of their revolution. National Trust listed it on the agenda. They're actually setting up a focus group that's going to meet at 2 different times, November 30th, December 2nd, just seeking feedback from architects about how the preservation movement can make significant changes in response to national and global events and pandemic and climate-related disasters and social injustice, continuing acts that we've been seeing. So National Impact Agenda at savingplaces.org. Is that. And then there's some grants that, through Preservation Massachusetts that are listed. And the Architects newspaper is sponsoring, there's, I think, the second annual now, if the second or third, the Reuse and Renewal Virtual Summit is November 18th. So I attended one of those and it was well done. Otherwise, does anyone else, any announcements you want to share? Anything coming up? Hearing none, I will thank you all again. Thank you, Matt, especially, and hope to see you guys at our December 9th meeting, where we are slated to have the Preservation Alliance give us a kind of an update on all the hot projects going on, sort of a wrap up, maybe serve as a wrap up for this year. So stay well, everyone, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Wow.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.